Okay, welcome everyone. This is the third part of our four-part lecture series on the Basiaco movement, tradition and revolution, the story of the founding of the Basiaco movement. I'm going to drop the source sheet in the chat, and I'm also going to share my screen at certain times to show you. But this, if you click on that link, you should be able to download the PDF. So then you'll have it. What I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to sort of cover two different parts of the story. The first part of the story, I want to really start with the general halachic topic of women and the study of Torah, and how that plays into the stigma and the resistance against Sarah Schneer and the criticism that the Chavetz Chaim he didn't directly receive criticism, but through the criticism of his approval, there were those who sort of tried to temper it, and those who felt that Basiaco was too revolutionary. That would be part one for tonight. And then part two, we're going to go back to the story of Basiaco and sort of chart the institutionalization of the movement, where we talked a little bit about it last time, how the Agudas Yisrael's involvement, got it going. But I want to talk a little bit about how that transition from this grassroots movement, how it sort of how it moved from that revolution to sort of a more institutionalized and established school system. I'm going to post the source sheet again in the chat, just because I see that someone joined over here. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll see a source together to start us off. Download. Okay, so here is a picture of the teacher's seminary, and we're going to get back to that, God willing. I just thought it was a nice picture to have in the front, but we will discuss the entire, we could call it the second arm of the Basiaco movement, which was the teacher's seminary and the training sessions and conferences in the summer. Here's a source I want to read together with you. So this is an interesting source. It's a translation, an English rendering of the Sefer Makor Baruch. And this appears in an article that Rabbi J.J. Schachter wrote in the 90s called Facing the Truths of History. And it's a fantastic article. It's a long one. It's, I think, almost 100 pages. And in this article, Rabbi Schachter notes that in the book My Uncle the Netziv, which was the first, if I'm not mistaken, the first Art Scroll biography that was published. It was put out by, I think, the Lakewood Cheder in connection with the Art Scroll Publishing House in 1988. And it was really not a new book. It was an English translation of a book which existed for years in the Hebrew, called Sefer Makor Baruch. It was written by Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, the author of the Torah Tamima. And what's important about this English rendering is that there were some things that were censored and taken out. Namely, the specific passage where Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein discusses his uncle, the Netziv's wife, which was his, if I get this correct, it was his sister, if I'm not mistaken. No, one second. Book of these, no, Mrs. Reina, so that was later. Sorry, so he does later marry, I think, Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein's sister. But this, I should check my notes before but this is not that wife. This is his first wife. So the first wife is the daughter of Rav Itzela Volozhiner, who is the granddaughter of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. And so in this original Hebrew, it lists some of the Svarim that she used to study. And it lists there, on her table, she had a Tanakh, and in bold, Rabbi Schachter points out that it wrote Mishnayos there. It also writes in Yaakov, Midrashim, Menorahs HaMaor, which was a popular sefer there, at Tzemach David, which was a sort of a historic work, different Svarim, different Sifrei Musar, and different ethical works. But important that it was listed Mishnayos, that she was learning Mishnayos Torah Sheba'al Peh. So in the English rendering of this volume, the word Mishnayos was taken out. And I think it's just an important, I guess, proof of the stigma, even within, I guess it is still over 30 years ago, but about 30 years ago, but the stigma of women studying Torah Sheba'al Peh is still present, and specifically for the, let's say, the English reading public, seemingly in the Hebrew it was acceptable to be there, but then taken away in the English rendering. So I wanted to just start off discussion with that, because we always had known, and I think we mentioned this originally, that there were always gifted women who, by dint of the fact that they were in a yeshiva family, their father was a Rosh Yeshiva, or their father was a Rav, or their husband, whatever it is, they picked up certain things, and if they had skills and then they were intellectually motivated, they would learn, and they would learn whatever seemingly whatever they'd want. And but this was not the norm. There was no real institutional, framework for them. But nonetheless, even in this source, we still see that there was a sort of an uncomfortable, or maybe we could call it sort of a sort of a secret, because it was there in the Hebrew, but for a larger public audience, perhaps it was seen as inappropriate. So really, I wanted to start off just this night to discuss why was there this stigma, maybe a little bit people are uncomfortable of women studying Torah Sheba'al Peh, Gemara, part of the oral traditions, or Mishnayos for this particular case, and why that would be. And then that's very much related to sort of the criticism and pushback against the Basiaco movement initially. So if you look on the source sheets, in source number 2, the first source, I'm not gonna do everything thoroughly. It's a large topic, and I want to leave room for sort of the historical part of the series, but I'm going to try to touch at least on the main points. So if we don't do a source, it's not because it's not valuable. I feel like there's a lot to cover. So one of the primary sources for this discussion is the Gemara in Kiddushin. The Gemara in Kiddushin, Daf Chaf Tes Amud Beis, understands from the psukim in Kriya Shema that it says v'limadatem. It says in Kriya Shema v'limadatem osam es benechem es benechem. You should teach them, or you shall study or teach your children. Now, you could see the word benechem as referring to your children, or you could translate it more narrowly as your sons. And the Gemara chooses to interpret it narrowly and interpret it as benechem v'lo benosechem. You should teach your son's Torah, but not your daughter's Torah. And the Gemara in this discussion, this narrative, basically, to summarize, says that for women, the obligation of Torah study is not commanded, it's not obligatory, whereas for men, it is obligatory, because the people who we teach, who are obligated to teach, those themselves of that are going to be obligated themselves, and those who are not obligated to be taught, so then the people that are teaching them also are not obligated. So since a man is obligated to teach his son Torah, but not his daughter, so we understand that women would not be obligated to study Torah. However, so that's number one. The obligation for Talmud Torah, for the study of Torah, is for men and not for women. That seems to be pretty clear cut. But it's not so simple, because the Shulchan Aruch writes this, and I assume this is what most people are used to doing, and I assume they did this in Basiaco too, that women make a Birchas HaTorah in the morning, Birchas HaShachar in the morning. You say, Asok b'divrei Sora, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch writes in source number 3, that women nashim mivrachos berachas Torah, that they make a berachas Torah. They say the bracha. How could they say a berachas Torah if they're not obligated to learn Torah? So the Magen Avram, a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, picks up on this, and he writes that they are obligated to learn the halachos that are relevant to them. And there are others that say the same idea, but we see that even though women may not be obligated from the Gemara Kedushin, but there's a certain level of obligation that they do have, which is to understand. Obviously, you can't keep halacha, you can't follow what the Torah says if you don't know what the Torah says, and therefore there is a level of obligation, perhaps not the same level as a man, but it is a level of obligation nonetheless. The more problematic Gemara in terms of women learning Torah is the Gemara in Sota. The Gemara in Sota is a graphic one. It's describing the promiscuous woman in the Torah who is warned, but she still secludes herself with a man. And there's a test that is administered to her, and she drinks from the water. And basically, if she is found to be guilty, she is said to be basically to blow up. Now, this becomes relevant because there is a period of time for which she should blow up, and the Mishnah assumes that if she has a schus, if she has a merit, then it will push off that her punishment. So because of this merit that the Gemara assumes to be her study of Torah, her knowledge of Torah. So Rabbi Naazeh says, because I want, on the off chance that my daughter unfortunately becomes involved or anyone's daughter becomes involved in this issue and she goes with a man and this whole thing, he wants her to have that extra few years to protect herself. So therefore, Rabbi Naazeh says, Chayiv Adam l'lamed es bito Torah. Because of this concern, I want one's daughter should teach Torah. He actually says the word chayiv, a person is obligated to teach one's daughter Torah. However, and this is the following opinion is the one that we rule according to. Rabbi Eliezer says no. Kol ha'malami bito Torah.
I just shut my video in case you want to come by. Oops, my
tiflos. Anyone who studies Torah, teaches his daughter Torah, is as if they're teaching them tiflos, which we will translate. It says here promiscuity. I would think there's different understandings of that word. Without going into all the details, the way that some explain it to be is that they're going to misunderstand the Torah. They're not going to understand the details and the intricacies. Now, this is the way that seemingly most of the poskim rule like Rabbi Eliezer. So if we rule like Rabbi Eliezer, it seems as though there is this problem in Torah. There is, in fact, potentially a prohibition. Now, last time we learned the footnote of the Chafetz Chaim, which I don't want to go through it again. But remember, the Chafetz Chaim says that this Gemara is not referring to our times, and in our times it's necessary for them to learn Torah. And we talked about how it must be that the Chafetz Chaim understood that the Gemara was obligatory or compelled Torah study for women, which we'll get to in a moment. But I think it's just important for you to know that source, and we'll get to the Chafetz Chaim in a moment. One last source before we get to the Chafetz Chaim again is the Prisha. The Prisha, which is a commentary on the Torah, and Rav Yeshua Falk wrote this work. He writes that it's because of the majority of women, which they assumed at that time, probably that was the reality they were living in, that most women didn't have the skills, didn't have the intellectual background. Most women would misunderstand if they were taught, and they would come to what we call tiflus, or mocking the Torah, or not understanding it, or becoming, missing the point. But he writes that if we see that a woman is motivated and wants to study on her own, she's teaching herself, then we see she clearly is distinguishing herself and showing that she wants to study Torah, and showing that she's obviously capable and willing and understanding, and there's no problem with that whatsoever. Let us turn it to the Chavetz Chaim for a moment. We're not going to go through the whole thing because we discussed it last time. But here is the Sefer Likutei Halachos, which is what the Chavetz Chaim did is he compiled the basic bottom line of the halachos for the as a commentary on the Masechtos in the Gemara. And in this work, he writes that in our time, Rabbi Eliezer must not be relevant, and even though it wasn't previous generations, here is his footnote that other generations that they were able to understand and be follow the ancestral tradition. But in our time, where everyone is sort of living in different places, and the ancestral alliances and allegiances are basically disappearing. So therefore, it is a mitzvah rabbah. Let me just find that one word over there. He says mitzvah, bevadai mitzvah rabbah. Let me make it a little bigger for you. Bevadai mitzvah rabbah, and in our times, it is a great mitzvah, lelamdam chumash, begam neviim, beksuvim, umusri chazal, to teach them the Bible, prophets, and different ethical works of our sages. Kigo, Maseches Avos, Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, Sefer Menorahs HaMaor, as I mentioned, a popular work in that time. Okay, so the Chavetz Chaim is sort of the first on the record as to saying that this Gemara is not relevant for our times. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about this because it seems a little bit strange. How can we understand the Chavetz Chaim? He wasn't exactly a reform rabbi saying that the Torah has changed because our times have changed. The Chavetz Chaim was extremely conservative, and it doesn't really fit with his overall perspective. So, a few things. First of all, Rachel Manikin, who's she's a scholar of Jewish history, and she came out with a book recently about Jewish women in Eastern Europe, and I think in general in Europe. So she has an important article on this piece of the Chavetz Chaim, and she believes, and I think this is an accurate theory, that the Chavetz Chaim, one of his major callings, and he wrote many Sfarim. Many of the Sfarim that he wrote were works in order to encourage the observance of Torah. He wrote specifically a work called Taharas Yisrael, which was a handbook on the family purity, Taharas Mishpacha. Many things that he did throughout his career. He actually spoke at an Neshei Aguda conference that he was invited to in 1929. And he told women that they have to keep halacha, they have to keep Taharas Mishpacha. He was very concerned with halachic observance, and he wanted the communities to be mindful of that. And he wrote a work called Machane Yisrael, specifically for people in the Russian army. He was very motivated. That's why he wrote Shmiras Haloshin, the sefer on Lashon Hara. He was very pragmatic. Whatever's going to work, whatever we need the community to do, that's what he's going to do. So rather than saying that the Chavetz Chaim was, changing the halacha, it seems to fit with his overarching goals of creating more observant Jews, as opposed to his goal was not necessarily to create more learned women, although that would be sort of an outgrowth. But you can see in his concerns and what he's telling them to learn in Chumash and Musar, it's to teach them sort of the ethics and the values of Judaism. I see someone wrote in the chat, what about Rashi's daughters being so learned? So it's interesting. Rashi's daughters have this reputation in the folklore that they were very learned. It's possible that they were. I know there were some fictional books about Rashi's daughters and the different things that happened to them. It doesn't surprise me because Rabbeinu Tam, who was one of the Balei Tosfos, he's a grandson of Rashi, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe he's a son. I have to check that one up. I think grandson. So it doesn't surprise me that his daughters were learned. But similar to the Mitziv's wife, it's possible that they studied from their father, but there wasn't a formalized, structure. And perhaps like the Prisha said, like the Rav Yeshua Falk, his comment that if it seems as though they're, showing promise and they can learn and it's working, then that wouldn't be within the prohibition of teaching them and forcing them to learn when it wouldn't be beneficial for them. So that's just one piece of the Chavetz Chaim and why was he motivated to sort of, it seems almost like, make the Gemara and Sota sort of not relevant anymore for our day and age. It probably fits with his general sort of goal to, create a more learned, community. Okay. Let us turn to some of the backlash. So I won't read all of it inside, but I want to just share with you a piece by the Klosenberger Rebbe. Let me share my screen. Okay, so this is a tshuva written by the Klosenberger Rebbe of Yekasiel Yehuda Halberstam in Divrei Yatziv, or Yitziv. And in this, he says, the Chavetz Chaim was the Kohen Gadol. He was the great tzaddik. And he's referring to them as a Kohen Gadol because he was a Kohen. So Yerushalayim Meir Cohen was a Kohen. But he says, according to his understanding, it couldn't have possibly been that the Chavetz Chaim was saying that you should basically disregard a halacha that was been followed for generations and generations. And he says, even though the Chavetz Chaim does write that they should study Torah, it's all not lechatchila. He's saying if you have to, but even the Chavetz Chaim, he's saying that it's not ideal. Even more, I guess, harsh is Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe. The Satmar Rebbe in Vayol Moshe explicitly claims, and again, this is probably because he wants to be respectful to the Chavetz Chaim. He doesn't want to say explicitly that he disagrees, but he felt, rightly or wrongly, that the Chavetz Chaim did not ever allow women to study Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, you may say, what do you mean? Didn't the Chavetz Chaim say that they could learn Chumash? Doesn't that include the study of Rashi? So he writes explicitly here, no. The Chavetz Chaim wrote they should learn Chumash because that was never a problem. The Chavetz Chaim wasn't changing anything. The study of Torah Shebichsav, that was always allowed. When he said Chumash, he just meant Chumash alone, and certainly not Rashi. Rashi includes the statements of our sages, of our Chazal, and that is Torah Sheba'al Peh. That is the oral traditions, and those are off limits to women. So that is one area which contributed to sort of the tension and the pushback against the movement of Basiaco, as we see in a few sources, but it was certainly well beyond just a few sources, but within more, you could call them more traditional, perhaps realms, more traditional conservative elements in the community. So perhaps they felt that because of this Gemara and Sota, because of Rabbi Eliezer's prohibition, that women should not be studying Torah, and for sure not Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, moving to a different sort of controversy. Now, Beis Yaakov was not just teaching Torah. They taught Chumash, Tanakh, like the Chavetz Chaim writes in Likutei Halachos, that was allowed. They taught them, Pirkei Avos, and a strong emphasis on Sham Shmuel Hirsch's teachings. But they also were, in some cases, and for sure, we'll see in the Beis Yaakov and Brisk, there was a study of secular studies. They accepted, and as we mentioned in the first part of this lecture series, they accepted and were very influenced by Rav Sham Shmuel Hirsch and his Torah Im Derech Eretz approach, which included the study of secular studies. And why I mentioned that is because there was a Beis Yaakov movement, Beis Yaakov school that was started in Brisk. And Sarah Schneer sent Vichna Kaplan, who was originally Vichna Eisen, and then she married Baruch Kaplan. She starts the Beis Yaakov in America in the 40s. But before that, she actually started a school in the Beis Yaakov in Brisk. And here is a picture of the Basiaco and Briscoe right over here. And the Brisker Rav Yitzchak Soloveitchik, or Belville, started this. He was supportive of the starting of the school. Now, this is, by the way, this comes from a book that was written by Rebbetzin Daniela S. Leibowitz. She, I think, was the second wife of Rev Henoch Leibowitz, if I'm not mistaken, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chavetz Chaim. And she wrote a biography, a very good biography on Rebbetzin Vichna Kaplan, and she co-wrote it with Devorah Glitzman. So in this book, she actually has a few stories that she got, that she was told from the family through Rebbetzin Lifsha Soloveitchik Feinstein, who was originally she was Soloveitchik. She was the Brisker Rav's daughter. Just want to make sure that I'm right on this one. She was the Brisker Rav's daughter. I believe, I wrote it down somewhere. I believe she was the Brisker Rav's daughter. And she recalls some of these early years in Brisk and sort of the Brisker Rav's opinion and what happened. So basically, she recalls that Vichna Eisen was very close with the Brisker Rav. And remember that the Briskers are very traditional, very conservative. Nothing should change. Everything is, very traditional. And the Basiaco schools taught Limudei Kodesh and Limudei Chol. And so not only did the Brisker Rav support the school, he also sent his daughters to the school. But one day there was a representative from the Polish Board of Education, and they came to inspect the school. And in one of the classes, a girl was called up to answer questions on Polish geography, and she was very, very knowledgeable, exceptional. And the inspector thought she should be attending a prestigious university. And they said, "What's her name?" And she said, "Lifsha Soloveitchik." So I think this is the daughter of the Brisker Rav, who we are hearing this story through, I think, the children of her. But this is the story that we got from Rebbetzin Lifsha Soloveitchik, who told this to her daughters, that she was very good in secular studies. So what happened immediately? The Brisker Rav, heard about this. Apparently, the inspector met the Brisker Rav and said she was an amazing student. He was trying to, praise his daughter, and right away he took her right out of the school. That's it. No more Basiaco for my daughter. So, even though he didn't allow his daughters to attend the school, he did support the school, and he did. He just didn't feel it was the right thing for his own family. But why I bring that to your attention is because it shows you another point of tension in which the Basiaco school was under some criticism. And even though this wasn't, a full-out criticism, because the Brisker Rav supported the school, but we see that the more traditional, maybe more conservative elements had certain issues with the direction that the schools were going in. However, over time, the majority of the Rabbanim, and we went through some of this with the Ger Rebbe last time, and Rav Chaim Ozer, they wrote letters of support. And by 1933, we have the Chavetz Chaim's letter of support. In 1938, we have other Rabbanim, Rav Aaron Volkin, supporting the Basiaco movement, and mostly positive and slow acceptance of the Basiaco movement. So I want to now move on to part B of part 3. And I want to talk a little bit about this next stage in the Basiaco story, which is the teachers training seminaries, as well as the institutionalization of the Basiaco movement. So this is a picture of the students in the Krakow Seminary over here, as I mentioned and as I showed you in the first page. And they had to create this seminary because there simply weren't enough teachers, because nobody knew, they didn't know how to learn or how to study or anything. So they created a school to train teachers over the summers. It started off in the summers, then became actually a larger network of schools. This is the very well-known picture from 2028 in Rapka, in one of the teachers' seminaries summer professionalization courses. Started off as being 2-month courses, then it's turned into 3. This was like a full-time, it was like a yeshiva. It was like really they studied, they learned, and there's an account of Dr. Leo Deutschlander and others, and Joseph Friedenson, who were agudists and activists, as we mentioned, who were very involved in the functioning and educational frameworks of Basiaco, and they came to teach there, and they wrote about it, how they were so impressed with the students. And it was sort of the next step to the institutionalization of Basiaco. And at this time, Sarah Schneer, who is not married, she's divorced, she lives with her students, she becomes this almost Hasidic Rebbe of sorts, where she's living with the students. They had Yomim Noraim, they had Shabbos davening, they had singing. She would eat with the students, teach this. It was all, she gains this tremendous amount of prominence through the movement. And that was sort of the culture of the early, I could call it the early 20s, late 20s. At the same time, as we mentioned last time, the funding that was contributed by the Keren HaTorah, the organization from the Aguda, helps to fund the Basiaco movement. And with this, we have sort of the beginnings of tension, which is transitioning the Basiaco movement from a grassroots sort of revolution to an institutionalization. Now, there is a concept which I think his name, if I pronounce this correctly, Max Weber, he talks about charismatic institutions or charismatic leadership. And he makes the following argument, that often leaders who are these charismatic individuals, they have to be almost bigger than, larger than life. They have to work outside of the normal framework of societal norms, and they challenge the very authority of the establishment. That is certainly the case with the Basiaco movement and Sarah Schneer. She was outside of the framework. As we mentioned, she was a woman. She was not institutionally accepted till later. And she was, in the literature and in a lot of the writings about her, she was this larger than life figure that the girls would run to just see her whenever she would come back from her trips. They would talk about just being around her and carrying her image in their hearts. And there was so much just sort of heroing worship. She was a very pious woman, and she was worthy of admiration. And there was a lot of sacrificing. They lived in her house. They didn't have much food, and there was this sort of like idealism and charismatic leadership going on. But according to Weber, for that charismatic leader to sort of create a movement that's sustainable, there has to be a transition from this charismatic leadership to what he calls institutionalization and routinization. And that is exactly the course that Basiaco takes. With the Aguda's involvement, with the Keren HaTorah, with Dr. Leo Deutschlander, with Yehuda Leib Orlean, and all these Gera Hasidim running the schools, creating curricula, and just generally funding the school, creating institutional standards. There was now the name Basiaco, and you couldn't open a Basiaco without doing these sort of formal processes and being in touch with the central offices. All these points were basically a transition of the movement from Sarah Schneer to the offices of the Aguda and the central offices of Basiaco. And I want to read this one source to you that gives you a sense of sort of what the movement was and where it was, and where actually the Aguda took it. So this is this comes from Naomi Simon's book on the Basiaco movement, and it's a recollection of Judith Rosenbaum, later Grunfeld, I think she has it wrong here. She writes Grunfeld Rosenbaum. I think she was first Rosenbaum, then married Dr. Isidore Grunfeld. But she recalls that Sarah Schneer, how would she teach her students? She would literally have these handwritten, primitive transcriptions of shiurim or lectures that she heard from Rabbi Moshe David Flesch, who we mentioned was the rabbi in Vienna who inspired her, the student of Rav Shamshon Hirsch, in that neo-Orthodox, German Orthodoxy. She would write down the lessons and she would almost organize it as a play. And we'll talk a little bit about the Basiaco plays and the productions. It was embedded into the movement from the very beginning, having these plays, dressing up, having dialogue. So let's just look at this for a moment to see what she was teaching. This was her sort of curriculum, for lack of a better word. So this is what the teacher would be teaching. This is what she would give to her teachers. The teacher would say, I'll just do the English. I'll try. Vos bist du? What are you? Ich bin a Yiddische Kind. I'm a Jewish child. That's what the people would say. And then it says, well, mit vos bist du a Yiddische Kind? What makes you a Jewish child? And then they would say back, I'm a Jewish child because I have the Holy Torah. And it goes on and on and on. And she would hand them these handwritten transcriptions of how they would run their class, how they would teach. It was very primitive. It was very, raw and not, wasn't very, for sure, not systemized or in any way, there was no curriculum really. This is in stark contrast to what the resolutions and a lot of the conferences that the Aguda and Basiaco made these conferences in the 20s, 1925, and they had these agendas, and they said we need to emphasize precise instruction, proper development, and properly trained teachers. And what they don't say, almost all of them leave out the mention of Sarah Schneer. They don't criticize her outright because it was, that would have been seen, unchivalry and unchivalrous, and it would have been sort of, she started the movement. She was this pious woman, and we're very impressed with her. But there was sort of this push and pull between the Aguda saying, we really need properly trained teachers. We really need precise, instruction. And knowing that Sarah Schneer was sort of not that sort of personality, and that wasn't the way that the school was working. And eventually, Sarah Schneer hands over the reins. She basically starts to take a back seat. And you can see this in some of the literature talking about the cornerstone event, and at the dais, Sarah Schneer is not there. And there's different interpretations by her students. Some of them write because she was so humble, she shone the spotlight. But what Simon argues is that the role of male leadership of the Aguda and of the Keren HaTorah, both on the one hand institutionalized Basiaco, because it was no longer just a women's school. There were men who were traditionally the authority figures, and once they took control of the school, they gave it sort of that authority, giving it that institutional strength. So on the one hand, it's succeeding, it's growing, it's becoming the norm. On the other hand, it's sort of, in a way, obscuring the role of Sarah Schneer, because she was seen as sort of this revolutionary in a sense, with respect, but at the same time, not, she was a woman, she was a divorcee, and she wasn't the same organized, methodical, and we'll call it institutional. So we had this big switch around in the 20s, the same time that they're building this teacher seminary, the same time that Dr. Leo Deutschlander is creating this curriculums and curriculi. I don't know if that's the word. At the same time that this is all happening, we have this shift in gender roles, where it was always a woman's movement. It was, as we mentioned, it was trying to solve many of the issues that were facing Jewish women at the time in Eastern Europe and in Galicia. However, once the Aguda took control of the movement and they became this centralized authority, both the involvement of the institutions and the men themselves start to create sort of this tension. And the way that Simon interprets this is that really Sarah Schneer is taking sort of a back seat. And something else that happens along with this development is a very, very new and interesting phenomenon. And that is that it becomes acceptable to praise the religious activities and piety of women publicly. And as I mentioned to you, these teacher seminaries were not open to everybody. They were only the elite, and they were studying Torah on a very high level. And it was Joseph Friedenson writes, it reminds him of yeshiva, where they were studying Torah Lishma. They were learning for the sake of learning, right? And he writes that they knew the entire Torah. Here is where I'm reading from this line over here. The entire Torah by heart. They knew Rashi, they knew Maimonides and Malbim, and they were able to recite entire books of prophets and proverbs. And he writes that it was these intellectual achievements were inspiring crowds and kindling a fire. So you have, on the one hand, sort of the male leadership institutionalizing it, giving it the credibility in the eyes of the community, clamping down on the standards of the schools, making sure the schools had teachers, making sure they had funding, making sure they had all these things that a school needs. That's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, you have sort of a new expression of the gender roles. And another point, so not only are men praising women publicly and impressed with their intellectual achievements, which is a new point, we also have a new development, which is the interaction between men and women on a very intimate level. What do I mean by that? We have people like Rabbi Eliezer Gershon Friedenson. We have Rav Yehuda Leib Orlean, who are men, appointed as the directors of female schools. So you have what was never the case before, was just a segregated community, which, as we mentioned, was often sending their students or their children to public schools. So it wasn't so segregated for them, but the traditional circles were segregated. And all of a sudden you have women and men working together side by side on the same staff of these institutions. And this did not go unnoticed. There were halachic responses about this. The Buyana Rebbe was asked about this. Rav Yochanan Wasserman was asked about this. And these are the leaders that supported the involvement of men filling positions in these schools, and it was sanctioned. However, that didn't go without criticism. In the press, it was actually picked up on, and some of the press wrote very cynical pieces about the Basiaco movement. How you had these big productions, which Basiaco would put on, these big plays. And they would be often cross-dressing because they couldn't have any men in the plays. Then a lot of the boys would really want to watch these girls in the plays. So they'd have all these eager boys lining up they were cross-dressing to pretend they were girls, to see the girls cross-dressing as boys in the plays. So the press got a hold of this, and there wasn't that much going on in these towns. So this was like the new event, and the press was not very supportive of Judaism, very secular often, and the people writing these journals were not so sympathetic to traditional opinions, and they would mock it and they would make fun of it, and then they would say that they would hire the Gerach Hasidim to make sure the boys didn't come in, and then once they kicked the boys out, then they themselves went in to enjoy and watch the plays. And a lot of these things we don't know necessarily if they're fictional, if they were really true. A lot of these press documents, but Simon points out that even if they were somewhat fictionalized, you still see sort of this new revolution at the same time that it's becoming institutionalized, at the same time that you have men stepping in, taking over and controlling, but there's also these new gender roles that are being reevaluated in a sense. And Sarah Schneer almost taking a back seat in a sense in the overall institutional structures. one of the big transitions for the movement was the building of the seminary building in 1931. So in 1931, they built this beautiful building, and we have a comment of Sarah Schneer herself, and this is, I think, also a very telling piece about her feelings and her mixed emotions about how the movement was moving, and obviously to great success. Obviously, the Aguda, as we mentioned, was the kind of the driving force behind the funding and supporting and really creating the institution of Basiaco. But Sarah Schneer herself, at the eve of the building, the opening of the building of the seminary building in 1931, she herself speaks of her mixed emotions and ambivalence about this building and what it represents. And let's read a little bit of this together. Gives you a little bit of sense of this sort of tension that is being lived out in the Basiaco movement. So here you have, that is the women and men, working together. Okay. Here is a piece from Sarah Schneer's own diary. And she writes as follows. This is on the eve of the opening of the 1931, the seminary building in 1931. So she writes here, such an uncanny feeling knocks at my heart. Precisely now, when we are about to realize our dreams. Again, remember that sort of that charismatic leader, how she's this visionary, and she dreamed of a school, and she dreamed of all women being able to study Torah. But now it's almost happening for her, and it's sort of coming to realization. But now fear and dread wash over me. Will those beautiful walls not allow, God forbid, the penetration of an alien spirit? Will the girls who come here to spread our great ideal not have economic motives in mind, and so desecrate the great idea to which I have dedicated my whole life? What is she talking about? She's talking about women teachers coming and getting paid, right? In her day, because she was this special charismatic leader, like using Weber's terminology, it was almost idealized. Like, you don't need to be paid, do whatever you can. This is, your Hashem will help, And it was, again, outside the structures of the traditional economic system. So she's concerned, if she has this school, she has these teachers, and they have to be paid, maybe they're going to come to work for her, not because they buy into the messaging, not because they believe in the mission, but because they want a salary. Maybe that's why they don't pay teachers that much in the Basiacos, because they want to make sure that they're really committed. But that's what she's concerned. And she writes over here, my teachers bear a great responsibility, and they must always remember that they are historic heroines and pioneers, and history will learn to value and boast of them in times to come. Now, again, without the background knowledge, without Seidman documenting what was happening, you wouldn't necessarily think twice about this. It's sort of she's concerned, she wants to make sure that it's successful, but read in between the lines. Why is she saying that they should be always remembered as historic heroines and pioneers, and then they will be praised in the future? She's saying that because, in a sense, and this is all theory, it's not, it can't be proven, but Simon is arguing that precisely at this moment where we have this building, which she, by the way, never actually lives in, because at this point she's married and she's living somewhere else. She sees this building going up, and she's thinking about how the movement is developing. And she's noting that we shouldn't forget about our pioneerism. We shouldn't forget about our revolutionary spirit, at the same time as she hands over the reins to the system. She's handing over the reins to this institution, which she sees as valuable, which she never challenges outright in her lifetime, which she completely, at least externally, was supportive of, but internally she has sort of this internal struggle, where she's talking about how, they'll praise us in the future. But don't forget, our teachers are supposed to be these pioneers. They're not supposed to be, get a career, you have a job. No, this is about changing the world, and that's just, to me, it's a very fascinating a fascinating just document of what she's thinking about on the eve of her building this building in 1931. I want to also share with you some pictures about the Basiaco production and show you what I mean about the key. Second, share my screen. Show you what I mean about the culture being so central to Basiaco. So here you have a picture, fascinating picture, of a 1934 Basiaco play. And as you can see, you have some cross-dressing over here, right? You have it looks maybe like a Hanukkah play. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe that's Antiochus, I don't know. But production, and that's what it's called sometimes in the certain New York Basiacos, or maybe even outside, just called production. And the plays and the theater were a very big part of the culture of Basiaco. And they really created their own movement, their own slogans, their own system of leadership. It was really, they basically created an entire subculture within Orthodoxy, possibly the most successful, which it utilized nature. They often went on these nature resorts, as we mentioned, or the teacher seminary. They did a lot of plays. Even today, they have this thing called Basiaco conference. What's it called? Basiaco convention. Yeah, convention. Basiaco convention, and they have these big productions, and they have to like prepare for years. And it's a very big part of the culture that Basiaco created. And that's part of the story of its success, that they really created sort of this new Jewish woman who is both very traditional, but also involved in whenever it's girls only. That was a very, again, like as they tried their best to maintain those gender roles, that was a big, very strong line for them. But it created this new Jewish woman, this proud, sophisticated style, almost like its own style. The Basiaco girl, and you could even see it today. People still feel Basiaco girl. They have sort of this feeling about themselves and with others in a sort of kinship, which they really created anew and sort of, as I mentioned, a subculture within Orthodoxy. Another fascinating idea that I thought I would share with you is the contrast between Basiaco and other schools of its time. There were other schools which we mentioned about, which gave women opportunity to study, and one of them were the Yavne schools. Now, the Yavne schools were supported by many Lithuanian rabbinic leaders, primarily Rav Yosef Leib Bloch in Telz, and the Yavne schools were, on the surface, you could say, very similar to that of Basiaco. They were traditional schools, perhaps a little bit more Lithuanian and less Hasidish influence. Like we mentioned, the Ger Hasidim were very involved in Basiaco, and Sarah Schnier's background was Bells. But they seem on the surface to be very institutionally connected. However, something that it is worthy of noting is that Basiaco was tremendously more successful. And one of the reasons that some offer is that because Basiaco, unlike other schools which may have had more traditional approaches, but they were schools which challenged, in a way, some of the norms of society, of the establishment. Basiaco had this sort of unique combination. It had a unique combination of both this idea of staunch traditionalism, where we're going to keep all the genders very separate, which, by the way, was able to produce, as we saw with the Basiaco production and with the singing and with the dancing and a lot of that vibrancy that it was able to create was created because it was in this single gender environment. So on the one hand, you had, like Hasidic environments also, they have a very strong vibrancy because of the single gender element. So that's one thing they had going for them. So they had a very traditionalist approach to the gender roles. But at the same time, they had sort of this, even as Sarah Schneer takes a step back, the movement maintained a sort of revolutionary tone for many years after Sarah Schneer even takes a step back, because that's the way that they saw themselves. They saw themselves as creating this new, sort of this new Jewish woman. And even though it had, as we mentioned, it had this pushback that there were those that felt it was too much. But once it becomes an institution, unlike Yavne, it sort of maintained this traditional revolution. That's why I called the series Tradition and Revolution, because it was a traditional voice, but it also had this pioneer, motivation. Weber called a charismatic movement. It had that sort of those overtones, and that's what a lot of it. That's what created its success in the 20s and in 30s, and certainly we see that their idealism and Vichna Kaplan, she, her vision of Basiaco's school in America. I mean, she signs on to it even before she has anything in place, and she starts the Basiaco in America and Williamsburg in the 40s, and you see the idealism of all the students who were like 13, 14-year-old teachers going and starting schools, knocking on people's doors. Like, there was just this overall sense of pioneerism and revolution that was very pervasive in the movement. While at the same time, they had these sort of traditional and almost Hasidic influences that created this very interesting dichotomy. But also, it wasn't a tension in the sense it was almost like a new entity. It became a subculture which both embraced a revolutionary approach, but also a traditional approach. And this, I think, probably, this is Yehuda Geberer makes this point. I think he's probably correct. This was probably a one-time event in history where you were on sort of the end of the 19th century revolutionary tones and the societal revolutionary eras that were, everything was going on in the world, and there was a lot of acceptance of those ideas of the age of isms, of socialism and Zionism, and that was sort of the cultural that they were living in. So being a revolutionary was sort of accepted. And by the time you have the World War II and you have the destruction, and then Basiaco becomes a force to almost rebuild, then sort of the traditional roles of becoming a mother and having children and building back become much more pronounced as the movement becomes, in America and in North America in general, and in Israel, it becomes much more a rebuilding, which is often the story about post-war American communities and Jewish communities. But in this particular, we'll call the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the Basiaco movement blossoms and explodes, partially because of the tremendous personality of Sarah Schneer, and what we said, she almost was like a Hasidic Rebbe for the girls, and she lived with the girls, and she, partly because of the Aguda's involvement with their funding and their institutionalization, and this last piece, that this was sort of the right time, was the right time to engage, and the right time for these girls to be empowered, because that was socially what they still had that revolutionary tenor, combined with the sort of the traditionalism that the movement was crafted in. So it's a lot of different factors. I think it's a fascinating reflection of what was going on in the time. I think there's more to be said. God willing, we'll do a fourth part after Purim. We'll talk a little bit about Basiaco in America, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about Sarah Schneer and unfortunately her passing in 1935. But I appreciate everyone's time, and I think that there's just so much to say, and so much that Basiaco really teaches us about the success of institutions and this tension about charismatic leadership and institutionalization, and there's a lot there. So thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing studying with you in the future.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.